There is a moment in every carrier air-wing operation when the sky between the aircraft and the ship is filled with invisible architecture. Data links, radio nets, radar uplinks, encrypted voice channels, the continuous flow of information that makes a group of individual pilots and a ship 12 miles below them into a single, coordinated fighting system. Remove that architecture, and what remains is not chaos. What remains is a set of highly trained individuals executing the procedures they rehearsed for exactly the scenario they are now in. But the procedures were designed for emergencies measured in minutes. At 8:44 a.m., the emergency was measured in something longer. The carrier strike group had been operating in the northern Arabian Sea for 6 days, conducting routine flight operations that included combat air patrol rotations, maritime surveillance tasking, and the specific demanding logistics of keeping a carrier air wing fed, fueled, and functional at sustained operational tempo. At 8:39 a.m., the strike group was running its standard morning cycle. 4 FA-18E and FA-18F Super Hornets airborne on a northern CAP and reconnaissance tasking. 2 MH-60R helicopters on surface patrol. The E-2D Hawkeye on its standard surveillance orbit 40 miles east of the carrier, and the ship itself proceeding southwest at 14 knots on the planned base recovery course. The first indication that the morning was not going to be standard arrived at 8:39 a.m. and 51 seconds in the electronic warfare officer's compartment. The passive receiver display showed a new emission in the VHF and UHF military communications bands, not interference, not atmospheric propagation anomaly, but a deliberate broadband jamming signal that was being injected across the frequency range the strike group used for its primary air-to-ship and ship-to-air voice communications. The signal's characteristics were specific. A sweep jamming architecture that cycled through the affected frequency range rapidly enough to deny continuous communications while leaving brief gaps too short for a meaningful voice exchange. Not a blunt instrument. An engineered denial system designed by someone who understood exactly how American carrier communications networks functioned and had calibrated their jamming architecture to maximally disrupt those specific networks while minimizing the power output required, and therefore minimizing the signal's detectability to direction-finding systems. The electronic warfare officer characterized the emission and reported at 8:40 a.m. and 12 seconds. The signal was entering the ship's receivers from a bearing of 008, northeast toward the Iranian coast 340 nautical miles away. The power level at the ship's receivers was consistent with an airborne platform, rather than a surface or shore-based source. An airborne jamming platform at medium altitude on the 008 bearing, transmitting at the power levels the receiver was showing, was at an estimated range of 95 to 130 nautical miles. An Iranian airborne electronic attack platform in the northern Arabian Sea, on the carrier's communications frequencies. The communications disruption reached the airborne section at the same moment it reached the ship. The KP flight lead, flying his northern patrol leg at 24,000 feet with his 3 aircraft sections spread across a 12-mile tactical formation, heard his primary radio channel dissolve from the clear coded transmissions of the previous hour into a wall of broadband noise that was not static and was not equipment failure. It was the specific, flat, all-frequency white noise signature of deliberate jamming, and he identified it with the immediate recognition of a pilot who had trained against jamming in every exercise and had been briefed on exactly this threat profile in the pre-mission intelligence package. He attempted the primary voice channel. Jamming. He attempted the secondary voice channel. Jamming. He switched to the Link 16 data net, the encrypted digital data link that connected his aircraft to the ship and to the E-2D. The Link 16 was not voice, it was data, and it was encrypted, and its frequency-hopping architecture made it significantly more resistant to broadband sweep jamming than voice communications channels. The Link 16 showed corrupted data, not jammed in the way that voice was jammed. Corrupted. The data packets were arriving, but their content was being degraded by a higher-order electronic attack that was not simply injecting noise, but was specifically targeting the Link 16 architecture's synchronization layer. A jamming system that could corrupt Link 16 synchronized data streams was not an improvised or commercially derived capability. It was a purpose-built military system designed against American military-grade encrypted data communications. The flight lead had not been briefed that Iran possessed this capability at this performance level. The pre-mission intelligence package had characterized Iranian airborne electronic attack as a developing capability, not a mature one. The developing capability had just matured in front of him. He switched to the backup SATCOM channel at 8:41 a.m., the satellite communication uplink that was the strike group's tertiary communications architecture, designed specifically as the backup to the backup for exactly this scenario. The SATCOM channel was operational. He had approximately 40% of its normal data rate. The jamming was affecting the uplink's edge frequency components but could not fully suppress a satellite relayed channel without directing the jamming energy upward at the satellite rather than at the carrier's receivers. The jamming was optimized for line-of-sight communications. SATCOM, by its nature, was not. He transmitted to the ship on SATCOM at 8:41 a.m. and 14 seconds. The transmission confirmed the jamming event, reported his section's current positions, fuel states, and weapon status, and requested guidance. The response from the ship arrived 41 seconds later, a delay that reflected both the SATCOM transmission round trip and the ship's Combat Direction Center processing the unprecedented situation of 4 airborne aircraft with no primary or secondary communications and a degraded data link. The ship's guidance was 14 words that contained more operational content than any pre-mission brief had covered, SATCOM only. EW source bearing 008, assessed airborne 95 to 130 miles. Hold cap. Await tasking. Hold KP. Do not return. Do not execute bingo to divert. The ship was telling the flight lead that the jamming was an active situation rather than a communications failure, that the source had been identified and was being addressed, and that the section's continued airborne presence on the northern bearing served the mission rather than requiring recovery. What the ship's guidance did not contain, because the Combat Direction Center was simultaneously managing 5 separate developing lines of effort, and because 14 SATCOM words were not the medium for nuanced operational guidance, was any instruction for what to do if the SATCOM channel was also compromised before the jamming was resolved. At 8:43 a.m., the SATCOM channel degraded, not lost. Degraded. The data rate dropped from 40% to approximately 12% over 90 seconds. A progressive reduction consistent with the jamming platform altering its transmitter orientation to address the satellite uplink geometry as well as the line-of-sight channels. The jamming platform's operators had noted the SATCOM traffic and were attempting to suppress it. At 12% data rate, voice was not possible. Short, pre-formatted digital messages could still be transmitted and received, but the exchange bandwidth was approximately equivalent to a telegraph. The flight lead had 4 aircraft, 4 hours of fuel, a partially functional communications architecture, and a jamming source on his northern bearing that had demonstrated a capability that no pre-mission briefing had fully characterized. He had been given 3 orders: hold cap, hold cap, hold cap. The implicit 4th order, which existed in the space between the 3 stated ones, was, whatever else happens, do not fail to hold the CAP. He transmitted on the section's internal UHF frequency, a short-range line-of-sight channel between aircraft in the immediate formation that the jamming platform's geometry could not efficiently target without also jamming its own receivers. The signal was degraded but functional at the 3 to 5 mile ranges within the section's tactical formation. He briefed his 3 wingmen in 30 seconds. Jamming event active, SATCOM degraded, continuing northern cap, IFF procedures active, fuel states reported, weapons status confirmed. Autonomous operations protocol in effect until communications are restored. Autonomous operations protocol. the specific term from the Air Wing's lost communications procedures that every pilot rehearsed and hoped never to apply operationally. The procedure that said, when you cannot talk to the ship, you do what you were briefed to do because the briefing was designed to be sufficient even if nothing else was. The briefing had been designed to be sufficient. The question was whether the situation that had actually developed was the situation the briefing had anticipated. At 8:44 a.m., the E-2D Hawkeye transmitted to the ship on its own SATCOM uplink. The Hawkeye had been on its surveillance orbit 40 miles east and had been monitoring the jamming event from the moment the EW officer reported it. Its own onboard electronic intelligence systems had been building a characterization of the jamming platform's emissions since 8:40 a.m. The Hawkeye's transmission to the ship at 8:44 a.m. contained 3 items of significant operational value. The first was the jamming platform's precise bearing from the Hawkeye's position, 031, which crossed with the ship's 008 bearing to produce a triangulated position estimate for the jamming source at 108 nautical miles northeast of the carrier over international waters. The second was the platform-type characterization. The emission profile was consistent with an Iranian Air Force Falcon-20 aircraft modified for electronic warfare, a platform that had been assessed as existing in the Iranian inventory but whose jamming capability against Link 16 encrypted data architecture had not been documented at the performance level being demonstrated. The third was that the jamming platform was not alone. The Hawkeye's radar picture showed a second airborne contact at 115 nautical miles northeast, a fighter-sized return, positioned 7 miles behind and above the Falcon-20 on a bearing that placed it between the Falcon-20 and any intercept approach from the south, an escort. The Falcon-20 had a fighter escort, which meant whoever had planned this operation had anticipated an intercept response and had positioned a defensive asset to complicate it. The architecture was deliberate. The jamming platform, its fighter cover, and the calibrated structured attack on communications channels in sequence from primary to secondary to tertiary. Someone had built this. The ship's Combat Direction Center had the Hawkeye's triangulation data at 8:44 a.m. and 22 seconds and transmitted 2 critical updates to the flight lead section via the degraded SATCOM channel. Given the 12% data rate, the transmission was compressed to the minimum content that conveyed the operational requirement. Jamming source 108 nautical miles bearing 014 from your position. Fighter escort north of source. SEAD hold. Recce tasking. Visual characterization of jamming platform. Do not engage escort. Report via SATCOM. Do not engage escort. Visual characterization only. A reconnaissance tasking rather than a SEAD employment. The ship was threading the specific needle of a situation that required operational response. The jamming could not be allowed to continue indefinitely against a carrier strike group, but that also required restraint calibrated to the specific authorities and escalation thresholds that the theater commander maintained. The flight lead processed the tasking in the specific, compressed way that experienced combat pilots process operational orders that do not match the mission profile they launched with. Acknowledgement of the change, rapid recalibration of the tactical picture, identification of the execution requirements. He turned his section north at 8:45 a.m., climbing to 31,000 feet. The SATCOM degraded to the point where position updates were possible, but voice communications were not. He was operating on the last transmitted guidance and his own judgment for everything that developed between the guidance and the situation. The Hawkeye's radar picture was the only real-time tactical data the section had access to at functional bandwidth. The Hawkeye was transmitting its track picture on the Link 16, which was corrupted but not entirely non-functional. Approximately 30% of data packets were arriving intact, giving the section a fragmentary but navigable picture of the jamming platform's position and the escort's position as the section closed the range. The escort reacted at 8:47 a.m. The fighter-sized contact north of the Falcon-20 began moving, not toward the approaching A-18 section, but repositioning to a flanking geometry that placed it between the section's approach bearing and the Falcon-20. An escort maneuvering to cover its principal. The maneuver was professional and suggested a crew that was monitoring the American section's approach on their own radar systems and responding to the developing geometry in real time. The flight lead's radar warning receiver activated at 8:48 a.m. A search mode radar emission. The escort's own airborne radar painting the section from 67 nautical miles. Not a targeting emission. A tracking sweep, consistent with the crew maintaining situational awareness on an approaching contact. The tone was not the threat-level tone that indicated weapons employment preparation. It was the informational tone that indicated, "I see you." The escort saw the section. The section saw the escort. The Falcon-20 between them was still jamming. At 8:49 a.m., the flight lead was at 51 nautical miles from the Falcon-20's estimated position. At this range, his ATFLIR targeting pod could not yet resolve the platform's specific visual characteristics. The range was at the outer edge of thermal imaging utility at this altitude. He needed to close to approximately 25 nautical miles for a useful visual characterization. The escort was at 58 nautical miles from the section, 7 nautical miles north of the Falcon-20, positioned to intercept any further approach below 25 nautical miles. The geometry was specific, and the calculation was specific. Reaching visual characterization range required passing through the escort's intercept geometry. The flight lead transmitted his positional data and tactical assessment to the ship on the 12% SATCOM channel at 8:50 a.m. The message was compressed to its essential elements. Section at 51 miles from Falcon-20, escort at 58 miles, visual characterization range at 25 miles, escort intercept geometry present. The message also contained one additional element that the SATCOM's limited bandwidth required him to express in the compressed language of tactical brevity codes, Request Engagement Authority Update. The ship's response arrived at 8:51 a.m. and 33 seconds. The response was not an Engagement Authority update. It was a lateral shift instruction. The section was directed to proceed to a flanking bearing that would bring them to visual characterization range from the east rather than the south, a geometry that placed the escort's current position on the wrong side of the Falcon-20 relative to the section's new approach vector. The escort would have to reposition to cover the new approach vector. The repositioning would take time. Time was the commodity the ship was trading for visual characterization range. The flight lead altered heading to the flanking bearing at 8:51 a.m. and 42 seconds. His section turned east, climbing to 33,000 feet, the Falcon-20's position holding steady on the fragmentary Link 16 picture as the section changed its approach geometry. The escort began repositioning at 8:52 a.m. The move was fast. The fighter-sized contact accelerating northeast on a vector that would re-establish its covering position relative to the Falcon-20's eastern side before the A-18 section reached visual characterization range. Fast, but not instantaneous. The repositioning required the escort to travel through a geometric arc that, at the section's current speed and the escort's current speed, left a window of approximately 3 minutes during which the Falcon-20's eastern approach vector was not optimally covered. 3 minutes. The section needed 5 minutes to reach 25 nautical miles on the current approach vector. The flight lead pushed his section's speed to maximum continuous at 8:52 a.m. and 11 seconds, trading fuel for approach geometry, accepting the reduced endurance in exchange for the shorter time exposure to the escort's repositioning window. The calculation was tight but executable. At 8:53 a.m. and 44 seconds, the SATCOM channel cleared, not the degraded 12% channel. A full-rate transmission, the signal quality jumping from fragmented data packets to clear, high-bandwidth communication in under 4 seconds. The jamming platform had reduced its output. The ship's Combat Direction Center was transmitting immediately, clearly the voice of the tactical action officer coming through with the specific quality of someone who had been waiting for this channel to open. All stations, comms restored, primary channels nominal. Falcon-20 has reduced jamming output, assessed as fuel-related power management. CAP section, continue tasking, visual characterization authorized, primary channels nominal. The flight lead confirmed primary voice channel restoration at 8:53 a.m. and 52 seconds. His Link 16 picture updated immediately, the full strike group tactical picture populating his display with the data that had been corrupted or missing for 13 minutes and 9 seconds. The escort was at 34 nautical miles from the Falcon-20, still repositioning. The Falcon-20 was at 29 nautical miles from the section. He was inside visual characterization range. The ATFLIR pod resolved the Falcon-20 at 8:54 a.m. and 12 seconds. The thermal image at 29 nautical miles showed an aircraft in the medium twin-engine transport category, the specific airframe proportions of a modified Dassault Falcon-20, with a non-standard equipment pod visible on the underside of the fuselage and a secondary antenna array on the upper fuselage spine that was not present on the Falcon-20's standard commercial configuration. The pod and the antenna array were the jamming system's external hardware, the specific visual confirmation that the intelligence analyst needed to formally characterize the Iranian airborne electronic attack platform at the configuration level. The ATFLIR imagery was transmitting to the ship in real time on the restored communications. At 8:54 a.m. and 41 seconds, the ship's Combat Direction Center confirmed receipt of visual characterization imagery and transmitted the section's updated tasking. Imagery received. Breakoff, return to base. CAP tasking to following section. Good work. The flight lead turned his section south at 8:54 a.m. and 48 seconds. The Falcon-20 continued northeast on its own heading, its jamming output still reduced. The escort rejoined the Falcon-20's position as the American section departed, covering the return transit the way it had covered the jamming operation, patient and professional and completely on the wrong side of a situation that had already produced its outcome. The 13 minutes and 9 seconds during which the strike group's communications architecture had been systematically disrupted were documented with the precision that an event of that consequence required. The after-action assessment identified 3 findings of immediate operational significance. The first was the capability upgrade. The Falcon-20's ability to corrupt Link 16 synchronized data architecture, not merely jam voice communications, represented a demonstrated operational capability that no previous Iranian electronic warfare assessment had characterized at this performance level. The finding required a re-evaluation of every assumption in the Fifth Fleet's communications resilience planning that rested on Link 16 as a jamming-resistant primary data link. The second was the escalation to SATCOM response time. From the moment primary voice channels were jammed to the moment the flight lead established SATCOM contact was 2 minutes and 23 seconds. During those 2 minutes and 23 seconds, 4 armed combat aircraft in the vicinity of an active Iranian electronic attack platform were operating without any communications with their carrier. The 2-minute, 23-second gap was within the Autonomous Operations Protocol's design parameters. The finding noted that a more capable platform, one able to jam the SATCOM link faster than the Falcon-20 had achieved, could extend that gap to operationally consequential duration. The third finding was the escort asset. The presence of a fighter escort for the jamming platform demonstrated that Iran was treating its airborne electronic attack capability as a protected strategic asset rather than an expendable one. A protected strategic asset was a platform whose operators intended to employ it repeatedly. Repeatedly employed against carrier communications architecture produced a doctrinal threat that was categorically different from a one-time demonstration. The intelligence report that carried these 3 findings was transmitted to Pacific Command and to the Office of Naval Intelligence at 2 p.m. Its distribution was wide and its priority was high. The paragraph that received the most attention in the review process was not the technical findings. It was the operational assessment paragraph, which noted that the Falcon-20 crew had demonstrated a calibrated, sequenced attack on American carrier communications. Primary voice, secondary voice, link 16, SATCOM, that was consistent with an operational concept rehearsed specifically against carrier air-wing communications architecture. The concept was not improvised. It was prepared, practiced, and executed with the specific confidence of a crew that had done this in training before they did it operationally. The flight lead completed his debrief at 11:30 a.m. He had been airborne for 4 hours and 12 minutes, had operated under complete communications denial for 13 minutes, had executed a visual characterization tasking under escort threat geometry with degraded situational awareness, and had returned with the imagery that the intelligence community needed to upgrade their characterization of a capability that had previously been assessed as developing. Outside the debrief room, the flight deck was running its next cycle. CATS firing. Aircraft launching. The communications architecture was operational, its frequencies clean, its data link synchronizing at full rate across the strike group. Clean for now. The Falcon-20 was somewhere northeast, its fuel state presumably requiring it to return to its base within the next hour. The intelligence community now knew what it was and what it could do. The operational planning community would spend the next 48 hours determining what that knowledge required them to change. The carrier air wing understood, in the specific, practical way that aviators understand things, that the 13 minutes had been a proof of concept, a demonstration. The next employment would not need to be a demonstration. It would need to be stopped. The work to stop it began in the debrief room at 11:30 a.m. It would continue until it was done. That is the nature of the work in the airspace above the northern Arabian Sea, and it does not stop when the aircraft lands. The frequency is clean in the morning. It is clean because the watch is set and the work continues. That is always why it is clean.